All right, good morning, everyone. For those of you that haven't had the misfortune of sitting through one of my sessions in the past, my name is Patrick Grillo. I'm Solutions Marketing Director for Fortinet, and regardless of what your ears are telling you, I'm actually part of the international organization based down in the south of France. So as I was telling the organizers, I want to thank you for the opportunity to leave sunshine behind and come up here for a change of pace. So what are we going to talk about? Well, a lot of these names should be familiar to you. I mean, this is a roll call of some of the, some of the most significant data breaches that have happened in the last several years. Now, I know I was supposed to be looking at 2014, 2015. I cheated a little bit and went as far back as 2013 with Target, because Target I consider the mother of all data breaches, if you will. That this was when everything changed. And I say that because it's when the public's perception, or perhaps the public for the first time, was touched by a data breach. Yes, I am originally from America. I've been living abroad for a very long time. But everyone I know shops at Target. And if you don't shop there, somebody in your family does. It was the run-up to the Thanksgiving, Christmas shopping season. So all of these things, suddenly, news about a data breach was no longer confined to trade journals. It was no longer a technology piece, it was a general interest piece. People were touched by it for the first time. It was on your local news, in your local newspapers. And people were talking about, people that probably still had trouble sending emails were talking about the Target data breach. So this was the turning point from my perspective. But there were a number of them, a number that came after that. Has anybody heard of this one, Carbonac? What about this one, the Direwolf? So it's not just the high-profile ones. The problem is continuing on and on. And I'll come back to these two in just a second. So the question is, why do they keep happening? What is the issue? These are major organizations with significant security budgets. And an increasing amount or an increasing percentage of that budget is spent on security. The latest numbers I've seen make it about 7%. So why do these data breaches keep happening? Well, for one thing, it's a high return, low risk environment. Companies are still trying to figure out what's going on. Some companies are in denial. And in some cases, it's just a matter of the numbers. Throw enough malware at enough sites, and eventually something will get through. And that's the other piece of this. It's so cheap to launch a cyber attack. It's been commoditized. You don't need any skill, and Target certainly illustrated that. The hacker there was neither particularly skilled, and the malware that was used was already known, but he still got through. And it's evolved from a high-value environment, something that took time to create, into a low-cost commodity that you can rent. You don't even have to develop anything yourselves. But there's still another factor that contributes to why these data breaches have happened and why they're still happening. Now, this circle is a generally accepted structure of advanced persistent threat. From my perspective, however, this is probably one of the most overused terms in the industry, because I think today there are actually very few true advanced persistent threats. But let's use it for a second. That it doesn't just I can go ahead and rent the servers as I just showed. But if I really wanted to do something sophisticated, there's a number of steps that I have to go through. And it's very similar to product development in a legitimate company. You define the product, define its functionality, when do you want it to come out, what price range, the target market, you build it, you test it, you deliver it. But there's one area in particular here that I want to point out, and it's this idea of the initial intrusion. Well, going back to what I just said, major organizations with significant budgets are being breached. They're being breached not because of technology, although their use and implementation of technology can certainly be part of it. But they're being breached largely, and I'll point out some key points here, because it's an element we cannot control. And I apologize in advance to any Daves in the audience, but this is our weakest link. Because all it takes is one person in an organization to click on a phishing email. I saw, we get them all the time. Recently, somebody found $8 million in a suitcase and wanted to share it with me. It takes just one person to click on that link, and the entire network defenses have been breached. So let's see if those lessons apply to some of those data breaches in the past. Target, again, using this as a classic example because this is the first instance, I shouldn't say the first, but a clear-cut instance of what I'm talking about. A company, a contractor to Target, an air conditioning contractor, who was using, by the way, a free trial version of an antivirus program, and they were considering themselves to be secure, one of their technicians clicked on a phishing email. From that point, the hacker now had login credentials to that company's network. Target wasn't their ultimate destination. It was just by happenstance that they were able to get in there. And once they did, they discovered from the air conditioning company, they had unfettered access into Target. Target's internal network was wide open. They were able to go to the point of sale information, which should have been segmented but wasn't. And from there, they were able to get information, stage it in various spots in the network, and using a simple piece of malware. Malware, by the way, that was detected by two of their security systems. Both their antivirus and their sandboxing system both raised an alarms when the malware was put into place. The SOC within Target either didn't see it, didn't understand the nature of the alarms, didn't understand or appreciate its significance. And from that point on, the hacker scheduled, and this is the only part of that data breach that was actually quite clever, he scheduled FTPs of that information to servers outside of the United States. But it all started with one email. The same thing, following on Target, we have Home Depot, the equivalent of B&Q in the United States. It's almost the exact same scenario. From outside of their network, a contractor was able to get in and get 56 million credit cards. Now, 55,999,999 of those credit cards I really don't care about. The 56 million was mine. I happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing some work on my sister's house while her husband was on deployment in the Middle East, and my credit card was caught up during the data breach. That was in July of 2014. In October, Friday night into Saturday morning, I got frantic emails and texts from American Express. Somebody had tried to charge $9,000 of Apple equipment on my American Express card. Now, when I was talking to the American Express operator, they're saying, "Are you sure you didn't make a purchase you forgot about?" I said, "Lady, I still use a BlackBerry. I am not I'm not Apple's Target customer. There's no way in hell I would buy something like that." Fortunately, my first line of defense worked, American Express's anti-fraud software. But what about all the people that were using debit cards in the United States which have no consumer protection? So this is the impact that these things have, and certainly for me, it really brought it home. JP Morgan, huge bank. The hackers found one weak spot in their overall defenses that did not have two-factor authentication, and again, with a phishing email, was able to get login credentials for that particular application. So, does the trend continue is the real question. And if we look at Carbonac is very interesting because it was a change in tactics. Now, traditionally, if somebody was going after a bank, what they would try to do is to go ahead and infiltrate your computer. If you were a home banking customer, get a piece of malware on your computer and try to get in that way. Here was a change of tactic. They attacked the bank itself. How did it start? With a phishing email. Once a bank employee, and this was a very targeted, and this is an example of an advanced persistent threat. They targeted the bank, sent emails, relying on one employee to go ahead and click on it, learned about the bank, and then they were able to mimic the bank itself and set up how to get money out of that bank, including programming a cash machine to start spitting out money at a given date and time. I mean, wouldn't you love to have been the person behind in line thinking, yes, jackpot, hope it keeps on. The second one is this thing called direwolf, and this takes it even further from what we've already seen. Again, it's a focused attack on the bank, but not trying from a consumer perspective, but from bank-to-bank perspective. And what they were trying to do were to trick banks to make wire transfers to accounts in another country in another bank. Again, it starts with a phishing email. But this is where social engineering came into play so crucially, because there was actually interaction between the bank under attack and the hackers themselves. Through the malware that was planted into the network, they were able to intercept communications, and so for the bank employee, everything looked normal. But they were trying to go to a web application to transfer funds, and it would get a message saying, system out of order, please call this number. They would call the number, it would be the hacker at the other end of the line, and would manually take them through the bank transfer or the wire transfer procedure. The other clever thing that they did, as soon as they did the wire transfer, they launched a DDoS attack for diversionary purposes. So the bank was so occupied with dealing with that, their services were probably down now, that they went ahead, focused on that, and ignored the fact that hundreds, thousands, or millions of dollars had just been transferred out of there. So how do we deal with this? If we go back to the idea of this advanced persistent threat, we can pretty much cut it in half and say technology can deal with some of it. But as we saw in the case with Target, technology has to be accompanied by best practices and relooking at how you architect your network internally. The Target network was wide open. It had a hard perimeter, but it was all soft and chewy on the inside. No segmentation whatsoever, even when certain compliance, such as PCI DSS, recommends that you segment the network for wherever your point of sale information is being located. But, I mean, that's technology, and we can talk about that, and there's enough vendors out on the floor that will tell you how to do that. It's the other piece, the non-technology piece, which is the real vulnerability that exists. But before I get to that, take a look at the technology again. Now, as I said, there's a lot of vendors on the floor, but I'll warn you, if you go to talk to any of them, and they tell you they can solve advanced persistent threats with a single product or a single technology, slap them in the face and move on to the next vendor. It's not possible. And I say that from a technology vendor company. What you should hear if you're talking to vendors out there is a multi-layer approach like this. Now, we've all built networks from a preventative basis, trying to make them as strong as possible to keep out as much as possible. The problem in the past, we thought if we built it, it would keep it out. And we know there's more ways of getting in. And there's a number of technologies, number of business trends that have led to this removal, if you will, of the network perimeter. So while you still have to focus there, it needs to be backed up with a second layer, a detection layer, so that if anything does get through, maybe it's malware that's never been seen before, or the systems in the prevent layer, firewalls, antivirus, whatever, haven't seen that particular strain of malware before, you have to back it up with with a detection layer. And then as soon as malware is detected, people, process, technology should come into play for your mitigation phase. And it's not just dealing with the immediate aftermath. It's not just dealing with, okay, 30,000 PCs were infected. How do I contain that? Or whatever the problem may be. There has to be linkage and handoff between each of these three sections. And so that if the whole thing started with a brand new piece of malware that because you've put, for example, sandboxing technology in your network, it gets detected, that triggers the mitigation. That detection should also lead to an update of the systems in the preventative layer so that the next time that malware comes through, and it will come through again, it's blocked. But that's, that's architectural level, that's high level, no particular details. You choose the vendor you want, you choose the technologies you want. I want to go back to our friend Dave because he's still the weak link here. Now, how many phishing emails do we get a day? This is one I got last year. And for me, it was fairly easy because I've never had an account at NatWest. And because, I work for a security company and relying on my own technology, I said, I'm going to click that URL. Well, the URL, the real URL behind what's appearing in the email was so well known as a spot for hackers, even my browser was able to stop the connection. So it stopped me from going there. Also, my spider sense is fairly well defined now, and I think I'm pretty good at judging emails, whether they're fake or not. But what about this one? This is a copy of a real tax fraud email that was going around the United States a couple of years ago. And if it's addressed to a small business owner, you think they're going to be able to decipher this? I mean, your first reaction normally would be, not what I need on today. So this is the issue that we're dealing with. And because you have a range of people in your organizations, some of whom are technology savvy, some aren't. The best way, the most effective way to try to deal with this is awareness. Have your own internal phishing campaigns. Put out stuff inside your own organization and see what kind of click-through rates you get. But just don't do the campaign. Put into place procedures and remediation efforts so that an employee has the ability to report something and without fear of retribution. You want them to know you can't stop everybody from blocking something, but if you can encourage them to report it after the fact, that's an early warning system. Now, I was giving this presentation last year in London, and a gentleman from a well-known financial institution said that's exactly what they had done, and it had gotten to the point where existing employees were telling new hires, be careful of the phishing mails. We run these campaigns, and they try to catch us out. Now, the thing that they did that was very good, they put a button on their applications that an employee could click at any time to say, hey, I think I might have clicked on a phishing email. What they saw over time was not necessarily a drop in the click-through rate. People were still clicking on emails. But what they did see was a dramatic increase in the notification rates that they were getting. So people had a chance after reflection, oops, I made a mistake, let me report it, let the company know about it. Is that the end of it? I mean, unfortunately, there are two things. One, especially as a vendor, we tend to suffer from shiny object syndrome. We focus on something until the next something comes along and we follow that and forget about the other one. The worst part of it, however, is there are just so many of these things. We've become hardened to them. And when I first researched this and prepared this presentation, I was looking for key examples, and it certainly did raise my awareness. But now I get so many notifications through syndications and other organizations that you just take it for granted there's going to be one almost on a daily basis. So take a look at the second half of 2015. And even though I've been living abroad for 20 years, unfortunately, I still have an intimate relationship with the IRS, the American Tax Authority. And like any country, tax fraud is a problem. The cyber criminal has taken it to a new level. So they had a major issue last year where the hackers discovered that there was a specific web application by the IRS where you could go in and get a copy of a previous year's tax return. And in the way the US system works, needing a copy of a tax return from 5 years ago, 10 years ago was perfectly normal. And it's relatively easy to do. It could be you want to make a correction to it. It could be you just need a copy for whatever reason. And what they found was that using information, they could go to this website and try to log in pretending to be somebody else. And if they had enough information, they could get past the multi-step authentication. What's your address? What's your mother's maiden name? What's your date of birth? Things like that. And if they could get through there, they could go in and, saying they're pretending they were me, get a copy of my previous year's tax return. Now, this was during a 4-month period, and initially the IRS said there were 200,000 attempts with 100,000 successful entries. They later came back and said it was closer to 600,000 with 300,000 attempts. Still a 50% rate. For those 50% that made it through, boom, you could get a tax record and either refile it claiming there was a mistake on the first one, or the way the US system works, there's a 3.5-month window of vulnerability from the time the year ends and the time you have to make your declaration and make payment for whatever taxes that you owe. So somebody in December, somebody could have gotten my tax return and gotten all my information, and in January, made a new return saying he was me and manipulating it so that he was entitled to a refund, get money back. 3 months later, I could submit my legal tax form and find out that this had happened. Now, where was the problem here? The first one was the original information. And by the way, I'm sorry, in that 4-month period, $50 million were defrauded. But it's a drop in the bucket compared to the $5 billion tax fraud problem the IRS has. So where was the problem? First of all, the initial information. Where did they get it? It was stolen from other data breaches. And here was a way of recycling that information. The second problem was in the authentication. It was multi-step, but not multi-factor. And if any of you have had the misfortune of dealing with Microsoft Live, they are very stringent on multi-factor authentication. It's annoying, but from my perspective, it does give me a sense of comfort that they have put that in place. Another major issue with the US government last year was Office of Personnel Management. That's basically the Human Resources Department. They were hacked not once but twice through external suppliers. And if we look at some of the quotes attributed to this second one to me is the most relevant. 80% of major data breaches are due to compromised login credentials, proving that, reinforcing the point that I'm trying to make here. Another one, these 3 companies, what do they have in common? They're wire services. Public companies like Fortinet, several days before we're ready to announce results, we send it off to them. Here was a group of traders working with a group of hackers where the traders would identify companies, let's say Caterpillar, Fortinet, IBM, for the hackers to get the financial information from the wire companies before the general public got to see it. Based on that information, they could go ahead and buy or sell stock depending upon if it was good or bad news. $100 million. This wasn't a data breach per se. It was just a new form of insider trading and largely started with compromised login credentials. Now, I think as a speaker in network security, I'm legally obligated to mention Ashley Madison. How many people had a subscription? Come on, let's get some brave souls in here. Yeah, I've never met anybody who had a subscription to Ashley Madison. We laugh about it now, but the key thing here was why. Why did this happen? Now, I want you to notice, before I go on to the next slide, what does it say at the bottom? Trusted Security Award, 100% discreet, SSL secure site. The impact team didn't read any of that, apparently, and went ahead, due to moral outrage that these sites existed, broke into Ashley Madison and a couple of other ones, stole subscriber information. I understand they actually left a note for the IT director apologizing, that he had done a good job, but in fact there was nothing he could have done to have kept them out. So what are the consequences here? They just broke in and made headlines, and as I said, they were morally outraged that these sites existed. There's been at least one suicide directly attributed to this data breach. When Ashley Madison, the owners of the site, did not respond, they went ahead and released the millions of emails, names, addresses on the deep web, and it spawned a cottage industry. Now, this is an actual email from a not completely innocent victim who did have an account on Ashley Madison, and these have been flying around for a year now. Now, this gentleman was quite ambitious. He wanted, 20 bitcoins, about $5,000. I've seen them as low as 1 bitcoin. These are the types of emails. This was the ransomware, the industry that started following the Ashley Madison data breach. The key issue here is when you subscribe to them, there was no verification process. So you could log in, create an account as a well-known personality, politician, sports figure, whoever it might be, put in an email address, they would never verify it. So when these names came out and were being released in batches, people who were truly innocent were being associated with this data breach and being accused of infidelity. That's part of the knock-on effect that this had. So wrapping this thing up and looking about the takeaways, what is it? Well, the first one, and it might be paradoxical coming from somebody from a supplier, but technology is only part of the solution. You've got to be aware of technology's limitations. And remember, your network doesn't stop at your borders. You have an extended network, suppliers, partners, contractors, remote employees. Those are all entry points into your network and need to be considered in your overall security scheme. While your employees can also be your weakest link, they're also your first line of defense. Give them the tools, give them the training and awareness to help minimize the success any hacker might have about your network. And finally, never assume. Never assume you're fully protected, and more importantly, never assume that your network is not already been breached. Gardner says you should assume you're in a state of constant attack and constant infiltration. Thank you very much.